Sprout 6. The bugs I kept at the edge of my range sensed it first, being about a kilometer closer to the source than I was. A massive chakra so large that it seemed to burn like the sun, even in the darkness beyond my range. Its presence was shocking in its sheer intensity, in more than one sense of the word. It was a light with such power that it almost seemed to sear my senses, and yet burned even brighter with rage. With a hate like nothing I'd ever felt before. I hadn't even known you could feel someone's rage through their chakra, but there it was, like a cry of fury that never stopped for breath. And it had come out of nowhere. I hadn't felt any sign of its approach. One moment there had been nothing, and the next it was there, sitting heavy on my senses like the weight of the ocean. Somewhere far in the distance, I heard something break with a sound like thunder, audible for what must have been miles, and a roar that was even louder came chasing on its heels. I felt my father and grandfather shift just a second after I did, sensing it too, with the other shinobi of the Aburame clan following just a moment behind. Motion swept through my range as others responded, inside and outside the compound, and in less than a minute an alarm rang and my clan was in motion, shinobi rushing to arm themselves and make preparations, even if they didn't know what for, while civilians began their panicked rush for some approximation of safety. I did my best to get ready too, for all that I was just as uncertain of what was coming, moving my swarm to gather what I needed, even as my mother rushed into my room and grabbed me. When she rushed me out into the hall, my father was already there, pulling on his clothes and armor hurriedly. "What's happening?" my mother asked, sounding scared. "I don't know," my father replied grimly, without so much as a pause. "But that alarm means there's been an attack." "It's the QB," my grandfather said, swinging in through the window, down from his vantage point on top of the house. My father's expression darkened even further. He looked at my mother and I, hesitated for the first time so far, before his expression firmed. "I'll be back soon, Himari," he said, putting what might have been intended to be a comforting hand on her shoulder, but he clutched her like he was holding on for dear life before pulling her close. "This won't take long. I'm sure the 1st and 4th are already fighting, so we'll be back before you know it. Just take Taura down into the tunnels until we return." My mother nodded silently, face buried in my father's chest. I didn't want to interrupt, but this was important. "Father, grandfather," I murmured, bringing together the things my swarm had gathered and having them hold the pieces aloft in a rough circle around us. I presented the first 2 sets of spider silk clothes I'd made in this life, along with a pair of the heavy cloaks the Aburame seemed to favor. My father lifted his chin from my mother's head to look at them, and opened his mouth as if to say something, before stopping himself and shaking his head, and smiling instead. "Thank you, Taura," he said warmly, and seemed to honestly mean it, putting it on as quickly as possible. But I knew that look. I knew the feeling behind it too. It wasn't a good sign. I'd worn that look before some of the biggest fights in my life, before Behemoth and Scion, completely certain down to my bones that it wasn't going to make a damn bit of difference what I wore, outside of how it affected my headspace. My father had stopped himself from asking questions and simply put it on because it came from me, and wearing something his daughter gave him would help remind him of what he was fighting for. To whatever extent he was aware of the properties of spider silk, which was probably at least decently so, he didn't seem to think it would change anything here, and if he thought so, he was probably right. I hoped he was wrong anyway. I hoped that it'd be enough, that it'd do something. That's why I'd put my all into making both of these. I hadn't known something like this would happen, but my entire life had been a crash course on how bad things could happen, and I'd put everything I had into making these, just in case, weaving them with all my power and skill and a memory of all the times I wished I'd been able to do more to keep the people I cared about from getting hurt. On the outside, they were plain, even crude, at least by my standards. Golden silk without any embroidery, stylization, embellishments, designs, or even any dyes. But where it normally took me at most a month to make costumes, I'd spent 3 working on these, and still considered them mostly proof of concept. I'd put my best bugs to the task, with my most recent generation of Yoro making the silk, carefully molding chakra into every thread, and whenever they ran out of chakra, I refueled them with my own, with the chakra of the bugs I fed them, and with what I'd gathered from the surrounding area. Then I'd run every thread through a carved block of beeswax I'd prepared, waxing the threads for the first time, before weaving together the double-layered cloves and coats. Then I'd carefully wax them a second time, which had taken some practice, heating up the wax with my bees and then rubbing a thin layer onto the outside of the cloves. The idea of waxing clothes was something that had come up in passing during my costume studies in my previous life. It had been used as a form of waterproofing in the early to mid-1900s, before it fell out of style, replaced with cheaper, lighter and easier to make alternatives. I hadn't that much use for the idea at the time, since all the added efforts could be replaced by, say, buying a rain poncho. But I hoped it to be different now. Since 8 ounces of honey went into making an ounce of beeswax, and a lot of time and effort went into making an ounce of honey, the wax was probably my most chakra-dense product. Now, what that meant, if anything, I wasn't entirely sure. But I hoped it'd help at least somewhat. The only downside was, I expected the waxing to change the color of the fabric, maybe even wash it out. But instead it caused it to shine an even brighter, glossier gold. I couldn't win for losing on that front. At some point I needed to find some cochineals or lag bugs and start producing chakra-infused dyes, or else just get a dye operation going to escape the damn color. And lastly, it was something I hesitated to even offer, just because it felt like a touchier subject to me, even if I wasn't sure either of them cared. But I'd rather do it than regret not doing it. I offered each of them a mask. Again, by my standards, it was incredibly, painfully crude. During my career in my past life, I'd outfitted my entire team and, later, most of the Protectorate, carefully crafting each and every costume. I'd spent long nights sketching designs, conversing with Glenn about aspects of presentation and more. But these masks weren't even painted or properly sculpted to show anything. I'd used wasp paper to form the mold, akin to making them out of paper mache, then waxed it, then covered it in dragline silk, before waxing it again, reminiscent of how I'd once made the base sculpt of Rachel's mask out of chicken wire and then covered it in cloth, unpainted and without anything in particular in mind. The end result were just rough approximations of faces, and they felt wrong. There had been a general feel to American superhero masks that didn't quite apply here, didn't quite fit, and so I'd held off on finishing anything until I figured out what did. Looking into gnome masks and such, the role they played on a mental and cultural level, but here, in the face of an emergency, all I had to give them was this. It felt woefully inadequate in the face of some vast and distant threat. "Thank you, little bedbug," my grandfather said, smiling slightly, having slipped on the clothes without a word before taking the mask and looking it over. "I was regretting misplacing my old one. You get some rest now, and we'll be back to wake you up in the morning." I nodded, though I didn't expect to do much sleeping tonight. They left, and my mother rushed us into the Abarame clan's tunnels, a massive network of halls and pathways stretching deep beneath the compound, holding many of the clan's secrets. Hearing the name, one might envision uneven passages of rough-hewn stone, but in truth the walls were smooth and heavily reinforced, a network of pathways to protect against cave-ins and all manner of worst-case scenarios. My mother carried me down to sub-level 3, into a room with doors on all 4 sides and a hatch leading both up and down. And I knew that if things got bad enough, this was one of the rooms with a path leading straight down to sub-level 12, which led to a tunnel that would lead out of the village. The ritual that had filled me with bugs had been done in these tunnels too, and it was where a lot of the clan's special bugs were stored, albeit behind layers of security and carefully crafted barriers. I could feel them, even control them, but I couldn't get them out, at least not quickly, which bothered me at this moment. When my mother sat me down, I looked up at her, asking the question I'd wanted to ask father and grandfather, but I'd known they weren't too much of a rush for. "Mother," I asked, "what's the QB?" My mother was biting her lip, expression tight with worry, and she didn't seem to hear me. I asked the question again, louder, drawing her attention for a moment, but still she didn't seem sure what to say. "A creature of legend," she said at last. "The nine-tailed demon fox." I'd kind of been hoping for more than that, but I was guessing a tactical breakdown of its capabilities was too much to ask for about some legendary monster. After speaking, my mother returned to being lost in thought, probably worried about what tomorrow would bring, even as the distant rumblings continued. The ground shook closer to home as a boulder, cast of debris from some distant attack, crashed into one of the clan's houses above us, and my mother flinched like something was banging on our door. Outside, the rumbling got closer, and the distant roar louder. It was like being on the fringes of an Endbringer attack, a civilian waiting for it to be over, which I now realized was something I'd never actually experienced. I'd always been either in the thick of it or far away, and experiencing it now, I realized I hated it. I'd rather be fighting, putting my life on the line. Because the thing with fights on that level is, being on the edges won't keep you safe. It just meant you had no say in whether you lived or died, that the choice was out of your hands. Faced with that, I regretted not having done more. I double-layered the silk clothes and coats I'd given father and grandfather in anticipation of the coming winter, but since the wax made the cloth less breathable, I hadn't wanted to go further, for fear of making the clothing stifling. But right now I wished I'd quadruple layered them. I regretted not having done better, not having armored it too. I'd been working on trying to do something with the chitin and the exuviae my swarm regularly cast off, hoping to find some way to make use of everything my swarm produced, to somehow make armor plates of exoskeleton I could add to my clothes. Between the ants, termites and amphids that made up the bulk of my swarm, I had over 1 billion insects worth of practice in shedding skins, but hadn't yet figured out how to use that for this. I'd wished I'd tried harder, done better, that I'd had time and a way to test the clothes I made, as if tangible results might hold off the dread I felt in an unknown threat. I wish I'd made the masks better, knew a way to craft them that would help, or even just symbols of good luck I could have put on them. I wish I was old enough to fight, rather than having to sit here, doing nothing like this, able to do nothing but hope that my skill and the amount of care I'd poured into those clothes would be enough this time, when it never seemed to have been before. "Are you scared, Tara?" my mother asked warmly, picking me up again and holding me tight, despite the fact that she was breathing heavily. I looked at her. I nodded. Your father and grandfather and the ninja of the village will keep us safe. The fourth and the third are out there, like they said. The QB is nothing to the two of them." Her voice in that moment was steady, but her hold on me was too tight for it to be entirely convincing. I nodded anyway. "Here, let's do something together, just us girls," she added then, holding a shirt loosely in one hand that she'd been sewing a hole closed in before the alarm rang. I nodded again, always keeping a few spiders on me. And there was another crash then, the sound of something being destroyed closer to home. A shape swept through my range, killing some bugs in passing, but it was too fast and large for me to make out any details of it beyond that. A limb, maybe? A tail? Or some weapon being used against the distant threat. My mother flinched, and the expression on her face grew tight with pain. She was scared too. For us, for my father, for our entire family and the village. She looked down at the shirt she was working on, but it didn't seem to help. The tear she was sewing closed was one of my father's shirts. In that moment, my mother gripped it tight and her expression broke. She had to blink quickly to keep from crying, worried that the people she loved wouldn't come home. Shit, I thought, feeling tears well up in my eyes too. Fuck. Because I'd been here before, and it never seemed to work out for me. I thought about Brockton Bay, the home I'd fought for all but destroyed in a passing attack, a testament to how I'd failed to stop the end of the world. I thought about how, even before then, Leviathan had shattered it, devastating it with brutal, casual ease, and ending countless lives along with it. I thought about Jack and the atrocities of the Nine. I thought about Delhi, which had been destroyed, wrecked so thoroughly that there had been all of one building left standing. Khonsu and Leviathan's traveling rampage, and how the twins had devastated Bucharest, and Annex dying before we could get to him. I thought about the fights I'd seen personally, and the consequences of the same, the costs of battles lost, or even not won in time. I thought of Sion and Earth-Bet and the graveyard that was the world I'd been born into. And somehow, more than anything, it was the feeling of impending disaster that... It made all of this feel real. Or maybe real was the wrong word. It had always felt real when I'd woken up, slept, struggled and trained. It felt real when I saw I had a new family. It felt real no matter where I went or what I did. But it didn't feel like it was my life. It felt like I was living a dream. Or that there was some sort of mistake. That maybe God or heaven or whatever afterlife did exist, and they were every bit as terribly run as every other bureaucracy I'd ever known, and someone had misplaced my file and reincarnated me into the wrong life. I was a Himibachi, a large blue, a blood parasite that didn't belong, but had learned to make the right sounds to get fed, until it grew up and even I didn't know what I was going to do then. But here, now, I knew this was my life, that it was supposed to be my life, because everything I cared about might get ripped away from me today, and I wasn't strong enough to do a damn thing about it. Someone had filed my records with exactly the right department, made sure to send me somewhere where I could lose everything I had, like I'd lost it before. And with that realization, the wall I'd kept up, that I'd been trying desperately to keep up, came tumbling down. I died. I'd gone mad to save the world, and I'd been put down before I could threaten it in turn. And in the process, I'd broken my promises, hurt the people I'd cared about, and left them all behind with the pain I'd caused them. I'd always been good at compartmentalizing. I'd been mostly successful at avoiding thinking about what I'd lost, or how, or why. I didn't think about my team, the people I'd abandoned again, or the ones I'd hurt. I didn't think about my father, who died because I'd failed to stop the end of the world, or my mother's grave that I'd last seen broken, or my hometown that was ruined and abandoned. I didn't think about my friends, who I'd cut ties with over and over again, but who'd still stood by me in the end, just for me to leave them one last time, because I'd fucking died. What was I going to do about it? All thinking about it did was hurt. I didn't really have any plans for this life either, or any idea of what I was going to do next. Should I spend my life making up for it? I'd saved the world and hadn't really had a lot of choice in how to go about it. Then, should I live this life freely, doing whatever I wanted, forget everything I'd done and all my mistakes? That didn't feel right either. Then, should I spend it trying to find a way to go back to where I came from? Studying that space time ninjutsu my father had mentioned to try and find a way back home? Earth-Bet had been destroyed. I'd betrayed and hurt everyone I'd ever worked with or cared about. If I could find my way back, what would I do? What would I even say? If I made it back, how long would it take? How much time would have passed? Would I be an adult by then? How old would my friends be? In their 40s? Their 50s? Older? If I'd been reborn immediately, at least, and this was just some far alternate Earth, maybe they were already long dead. Silly thing to worry about when I might not even live through the day, but if I made it back just to find they were all dead, I wasn't sure I'd survive that either. And if I did, I wasn't sure what I'd do after. Facing death again, it all came pouring in. I felt like I belonged here for the first time, like I was meant to be here. and I'd never felt more lost and terrified. "Shh," my mother murmured gently, voice and hands warm as she held me. Even as she tried to reassure me, though, her voice was tight, even pained. "It's alright. It'll be alright. Everything will be okay, Tora. Again, that sounded like she was hurt. She didn't seem to be, and hadn't seen anything that might have, but worried and maybe a bit happy for the distraction. I focused, trying my best to push out everything else, and sent my chakra into her. I didn't know any medical ninjutsu yet, but I already had over 1 billion buck hours worth of practice in exchanging chakra, and the fields were related, at least. I was confident I could lend chakra with the best of them, but even then, I used my swarm to help me to guide it, lending my mother some of my minuscule energy. I didn't mean to do anything more than that, but maybe because of my training recently, because of the effort I put into feeling with my chakra. In that moment, I felt her, and several things became obvious all at once. I paused and stared up at her, stunned. She was pregnant? My world shifted off kilter for a moment before the pieces clicked back into place. It seemed obvious in hindsight. The trips to the doctor, the time she'd spent out of the house. I tried to give my parents privacy during their alone time, for both our sakes. But I was only a child on the outside. I knew full well what they were doing at night and what could result from it. But I'd been lax, inattentive. I had bugs inside most of the clan, and spent my days watching them to glean whatever I could. So maybe I hadn't paid as much attention to the few I didn't have constantly bugged. And, well, maybe I'd figured she'd just been trying to stay away from me, because I was a freak of a child, but still. And yet, was it because her sister was a medical nin, or because she'd had test runs before? As I looked up, she looked down, and I knew that she knew. She knew that I knew. "I'm sorry," was the first thing she said, which stunned me even further. "I didn't want you to find out like this." I just watched her, still trying to figure out how I'd missed this. The baby bump was barely perceptible, slight enough that I hadn't noticed it until I'd started looking with my bugs. She couldn't have been more than 4 months along, maybe 5 on the outside if the baby was small. Her scent had changed, but she'd been pregnant with me recently enough that I hadn't really noticed the change. Even so, I felt blind and dumb. "I wanted to tell you, but I wasn't sure how," she continued. "I kept wanting to say it, but I wasn't sure how, and the longer I went without telling you, the worse it seemed to get, like I had been keeping an awful secret. And then I realized I'd been avoiding you, because of my own guilt and uncertainty. But I just wanted to say, your father and I, we weren't trying to replace you, and it's not anything you did. It's just something that happened." She sounded embarrassed. I didn't see why. Statistically speaking, she'd just gotten cosmically unlucky, having a child like me. Surely trying again was the best choice. I wouldn't blame her if she thought there was something wrong with me either, because everyone thought that, including me. If my new parents wanted a normal child instead of an eerie freak, I wouldn't blame them. But what she said next made my skin crawl. "Taura, you're going to be an older sister." Terrifying. The mere idea was terrifying. Me? An older sister? I'd killed a child before. I'd had my reasons and excuses, but I deliberately, knowingly, pointed the gun and pulled the trigger. And now I was supposed to be a what? A role model? A protector? For a moment, I almost believed in God and fate, because how could such a sick joke happen naturally? But it also changed things. My mother, Annette Hebert, had died long before I could do anything about it. My father, Danny Hebert, was almost certainly dead too. but I'd been too much of a coward to even check. My friends, some of them had died, the rest were lost to me in a different way. My home, Brockton Bay, had been destroyed, along with my homeworld, and even before the final nail had been put in the coffin, it had been a bad, bad place, at least until I left. I hadn't been a good daughter or a good friend in my last life, and I couldn't imagine that I'd be any better as a sister. But I'd die, for I let my brother grow up in a broken family, a broken city, a broken world, like the ones I'd left in my wake. I'd be damned if I sat here and did nothing, knowing what was on the line. I was already a master at cutting ties and losing things that I cared about. But just this once, I'd hold on even if it killed me. How though? I was desperate to do something, anything to help. In the face of yet another disaster, I could do nothing to stop. But I couldn't think of a way. I couldn't even get to the fight, much less do anything in it. I wasn't strong enough to stop this, or even to fight in it. Everything I wanted to protect was in danger, and I once again didn't have the power to do anything about it. Story of my fucking life, I thought. The thing is, I like to think I'm pretty smart. It's just that I'm willing to do stupid shit if I have reason to. What was I going to do if I couldn't fight this? Fight anyway. And see, there was a lesson I'd learned in my past life, and it was that if you're willing to do dumb enough shit, all kinds of things are possible. And I was willing. I closed my eyes, centering myself, looking for something deep inside me. I knew the theory of yin chakra, but I still hadn't had any success in using it. Because how does one tell where their physical energy ends and their spiritual energy begins? They were only perceptible when they mixed, but in mixing they couldn't be divided. It was like trying to see the blue and yellow inside of green. Even I hadn't managed to do so, for all the effort I'd put in and how hard I tried. But it didn't mean I had no idea where to start. In fact, if you really thought about it, it should be pretty easy to do, in theory. Just run out of one color, and whatever you have left is the other. Passenger, I thought. There was no response. I wasn't surprised. We'd only been able to talk that one time. But words weren't the only way to communicate. I'd asked for favors before, and it had answered. I'd asked for help, and it had given it. I had no guarantee that it would do so again. But trust wasn't about guarantees. When my heart stops, feed me chakra. And then, I had my Kikaichu start to eat my chakra. I had them devour it. All of it. Gobbling it up as fast as they could. And didn't stop them even when my instincts began to scream. I hit a point where my chakra seemed to hit rock bottom and kept going. Hit a point after that where instinctual fear filled my veins with ice and kept going. I faced death, and it was terrifying, like a monster reaching for me in the dark. But I'd faced death before too, and far, far worse. I walked up to the border of life and death and stepped over it, because I'd literally die before I did nothing. And then? It's hard to describe what it was like. Dying, I mean. Hard to describe, but not exactly unfamiliar. But for a moment, I saw. My heart shuddered for just a moment, stopped, and then restarted again as the Kakaichu that had consumed my chakra regurgitated it. It felt like hot irons piercing my chest, forcing my heart to beat. And even once it began to hammer dangerously hard, more bug swarms, shoving more chakra into my heart until I consciously stopped him. My mind empty for a moment before kicking into high gear. "Tora!" my mother said, catching me as I nearly fell off her lap, gasping for breath. My chest hurt, my body hurt, but in that moment, I'd felt it. Normally, physical and mental energy blended, and feeling where one ended and the other began was like trying to parse the red and blue from purple, or the black and white from grey. But in that moment, I had. In that brief moment of disconnection, I felt exactly where my body stopped and something else began, and I kept hold of it. Now I just had to figure out a way to use it. There wasn't enough time for me to practice or test it. I need to pick a way to use it and figure out the rest from there. There wasn't any time for me to make mistakes either. If my experiments with Yang Chakra were anything to go by, if I chose wrong, I wouldn't have time to try anything else. I'd have to choose a method and do it right the first time, and for that I needed something I could rely on. It wasn't a hard choice. Whatever I came up with, it wouldn't matter if I wasn't in a position to use it. And for better or worse, happy about it now, in this life and the one before it, there was one thing I knew I could trust. I guess we're still in this together, passenger, I thought as I gathered my chakra. Being able to feel the dividing line made this simpler. Gather spiritual energy first, then slowly add the physical. Try to minimize the latter. The less physical energy I used, the more effective chakra I'd have, even if it was limited to being yin chakra. At the same time, I reached out with the bugs I had gathered throughout the compound and its surrounding areas, looking for the people who'd managed to get to shelter and some semblance of safety, and began draining their chakra. Slowly, more carefully than I had my own, but I needed all the help I could get for this, and they wouldn't be using it anyway. I gathered that chakra and shaped it too. By default, it was balanced at 50-50, but I could afford to add more spirit to it. Enough to shift the proportions of the whole to whatever I needed it to be, and slowly I felt it begin to take shape. At the same time, I reached out mentally. With the techniques of the Abarame, I was no longer limited entirely by my range. I could feel the bugs that were part of my swarm even when they were outside of it. It was a poor replacement for my power, generally. A vague, distant kind of awareness. Like the bugs I'd given my chakra to were tiny candlelights in the darkness outside my range, instead of being truly and entirely mine. But it was still enough to find them. And I'd put members of my swarm in the hives of each of my clansmen. It hadn't been my goal at the time, but I'd put my chakra in the clothes I'd made too. Here and now I could feel those things in the dark, and it gave me a rough idea of where, because I didn't have the time or energy to guess wrong either. And now that I had a target in sight, I took aim, and focused that growing mass of yin chakra on my own brain, specifically on one particular part of my brain, between the frontal and parietal lobes. It would be a lie to say I wasn't worried about what could happen. My parents took me to my aunt regularly to get my brain scanned, to ensure there were no problems. And during that time, with the help of those scans, I'd carefully marked out exactly where my corona palentia should be, and then cross-referenced that with my understanding of my chakra network to figure out precisely what the closest path to it was. But I'd never been willing to take the plunge and see what would happen, because I knew at least one result that was pretty bad. I also knew that, say, medical chakra could overwhelm the body if it wasn't done with incredibly precise knowledge and control, and using it on the brain was an exceedingly advanced usage. But here was my logic. Medical ninjutsu used yang chakra, and yin chakra was obviously different. Why? Well, because if genjutsu was able to fry someone's brain if the caster made the slightest mistake, I felt like that would probably stop being considered a mistake and start being the main use for it. Since that wasn't the case, I suspected that yin chakra could be applied to the brain relatively safely. Granted, I wasn't, entirely sure where to start with what I had in mind, sadly. But thankfully it turned out I didn't need to be, because as soon as I channeled it into my brain and into my corona palentia, I felt my chakra getting drawn in, like it was being sucked down a drain, and the change I imagined started to take hold. My father and grandfather had told me that yin chakra gave form to the formless, which was so vague that it bordered on being a useless description. But I'd asked more about it and had gotten some interesting responses. The Nara clan apparently used yin chakra to manipulate their shadows, or rather, to make their shadows, something that was nothing more than the absence of light, into something that could be manipulated. The Yamanaka clan used it to make their spirit, their intangible self, something that could be sent out of their body and into another person's. The former was only limited by the volume of their shadow, the latter only by the physical presence of their spirit. But both made something intangible into something they could shape however they wished, given enough chakra. I gave form to something else, but then, in the same way, I began to push it. And I felt my range wobble slowly forward, like a train struggling to start. It was an odd sensation, an almost physical reaction from something decidedly not physical, but the motion continued, and instead of being at the center of my range, I found myself moving steadily to one side, the shift going faster and faster as it built up speed. I could feel it too, not just the bugs in my range, but the range itself, a massive sphere that seemed to respond to my thoughts. Like the Nara could make use of their shadow's surface area, I had my range's volume. And as a sphere about 1 kilometer across, that meant I had volume to spare, so long as I didn't run out of chakra or let it bleed away. Like I had with my chakra exercises, I mentally lined the outside of that sphere with double-layered hexagons, containing my yin chakra as it silently, invisibly rocked forwards. I felt the edge of my range approach my body and then pass over it, leaving a sphere and an invisible tube of hexagons connecting me to the greater mass, drawing bits and pieces from that volume as it got further and further away. And then, just because it felt right, I gave it a name. My father and grandfather had named the shape transformation that made containing this volume possible, but I'd named the technique that gave my power shape. Higanbana, I decided. In this land, it was a name for the red spider lily, but the name itself actually translated to the flower of Higan, or the flower of the other shore. It was said to be a flower that grew in the underworld, across the river of death. Maybe it was a hallucination, or my mind playing tricks on me, but you're the flower I saw on the other side. Now show me what else I can see. My wandering range kept moving towards those lights I felt in the dark, gathering bugs in as it went. And then, at last, it passed over a battlefield.